Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 24 in the history series, Rewriting Art History, Part 3, Being Fair to the Entire World. I'm continuing the last two lectures, so starting with number 5, the first topic here is trying to be fair to the entire world's art by distributing attention through time. In other words, 1 week class on the 1600s, the next week on the 1700s, next week on the 1800s, trying to distribute attention evenly through time. The next topic is trying to distribute attention evenly around the world, trying to be fair by geographic area, for example. And the last one is distributing attention by culture, which means basically that if a culture is equally complex to another one, it should have the same amount of time given to it. So just to review the previous lectures, 2 lectures ago was the topic was the lecture on the first 2 topics, representing women artists and representing race and ethnicity. The previous lecture was about provincializing or shrinking Europe and deciding on the canon. And then there are these 3 topics for this lecture. Distributing attention through time means that you would be taking an entire semester or a year and trying to do, say, a century in a week or a century in a day. In the history lecture 3, which was on timelines, I was suggesting that strict chronology actually doesn't correspond with the way that most of us imagine art history. And actually it's a challenge when you're taking an art history class to be aware of the fact that the timeline is shrinking and expanding, that your teacher's spending suddenly a lot of time with just a couple of years and then skipping really quickly over other years. And that's a challenge when you're learning to be aware of that, especially because the textbooks are insistent on the strict chronology. But a survey class could try to be fair to all of art history by keeping to a really strict timeline. Strict chronologies could be helpful. This is a whole lot of, it's a chart of the length of a whole lot of artists' lives. Strict chronology can be helpful, but narratives never actually give equal attention to each year or period. So a really strict chronology could be counterintuitive. It's possible to imagine a textbook on world art history with a very strict timeline. If it starts around 15,000 BCE, in other words, with the Neolithic cave paintings in Europe, like most of these shorter textbooks do. If the book is 1,000 pages long, though, each page would have to cover about 15 years. And that seems like possible. You can sort of imagine each page covering 15 years. The problem is that most of art history focuses on art after 1500. And within that period, most art history focuses on art after 1950. So the first part of the book would be nearly empty. So this is imagining such a book. This is page 268. So if you're starting at 15,000 BCE, by the time you get to 12,000, which you see on the upper left there, 12,000 BC or BCE, you're on page 268. And so this is the way that the timeline goes with exactly equal time increments. But in this case, there's exactly one artwork on this entire page, and that is one of these Neolithic caves with paintings in it. So you could have a picture of a painting of a bison. The rest of the page is empty. But later in the book, on page 982, you'd be up to 650 AD, and then you'd have way too many artists to fit onto a single page. So these are just some Dutch artists that were working around the 17th century. You could see at the very bottom, maybe you can make out Rembrandt and Poussin. So there are some that are in every survey text, but you wouldn't be able to fit in all the ones you wanted to, especially after you got past 1950. So strict chronology, very counterintuitive, and basically couldn't be done. In art history, in North America, over 85% of PhD students specialize in modern and postmodern art. So the percentage of modernists is even higher at art schools, like the School of the Art Institute. These are some of my colleagues, our faculty at the School of the Art Institute. All of us specialize in modern or contemporary art, which is even higher than the 85% of the students at most universities and colleges. That would make it even harder to make a strictly chronological approach, or even to get anywhere near a strict chronological approach. So in general, at art schools, you'll get much less art from earlier centuries than you would at a university. But even at a university, there will be entire centuries, even at the beginning of the chronology, a whole 1,000-year gaps where there's not a single artwork to be seen. Curators have also experimented with strict chronology. In the mid-1990s, there was a curator at the Art Institute of Chicago named Charlie Stuckey, and he had all the modern art galleries rehung in strict chronology, meaning that each room you went to would go, in order, 1932, 1933, 1934. And as a result, the art that you were looking at would skip back and forth across the Atlantic and all around the world, because if two artworks were done in the same year, they had to be in the same room. So just as an example of that, there was a Picasso hung next to a painting by the Romanian surrealist Victor Brauner, who you're looking at here, just because they were done in the same year. Apparently, teachers who used the Art Institute to teach the survey found it completely unworkable, because they couldn't take students through the galleries and explain the basic movements and the isms, the periods and the isms, because they were essentially juxtaposed with each other. They all overlap. In order to tell the story of art history, you have to allow for a chronology that's not strict and chronologies that overlap. The sixth problem is how to distribute attention all around the world. So it's a kind of a spatial problem that goes along with that time problem. If you were to try to do that, you could decide your principle of your fairness, like how are you going to distribute your attention all around the world. You could do it by regions, by nation, by population, by income. These are cartograms, distorted maps based on different criteria. The one at the top is the population, so that countries with larger population get more area on the cartogram, and the one at the bottom is GDP. So by North American standards, if the textbook distributed its attention evenly by population, as in the top cartogram there, India would get a lot of space in the textbook. And other countries that are typically very much present in textbooks, like France, would be relatively small. They'd be shrunk. You wouldn't be able to spend much time on them. So it's not an easy problem to try to think of being fair to world art by looking at the globe or thinking about these different criteria. I have, just as a thought experiment, it's kind of like, half serious proposal here, but just as an experiment, what if you were to try to be fair to all the different cultures of the world by looking at their languages? What if you were to distribute your attention equally to different languages, or language families of languages? That cartogram on the left is based on the number of languages in different parts of the world. And if you were to do this, you'd have to spend a huge amount of time on places like Borneo. You see on the lower right there are these two dark red round blobs. The one on the left is Borneo. The one on the right is New Guinea, because they have lots of languages. So New Guinea art would get a huge amount of space in a textbook. It would get much more space, apparently, than as much space as all of Europe. Or you could imagine a textbook that would just go one language at a time around the world, talk about the visual art that was made in each one, like in an alphabetical order. So a textbook arranged by languages could have an entry on Iroquois, which is a family of languages that's spoken in what's now northeastern U.S., mostly New York State and parts of Canada. There are some of the Iroquois languages are listed there that are all associated with Native American tribes. Iroquois people in particular practiced a ritual called the false face ritual. They made asymmetrical masks that are sometimes reproduced in art history texts, because it's very uncommon in tribal art to have asymmetrical faces. There are only a few cultures around the world that made masks and other representations that are asymmetrical. So Iroquois is often represented, but if you were to do this as part of an alphabetized listing of languages in your art history text, after Iroquois would come Italian. So that's maybe not completely fair, because Italian is a single language, not a language family. But anyway, just for the purpose of this, the next would be Italian. So that means you would then have something like Michelangelo's David after your after your reproduction of the Iroquois false-face society mask. And then after Italian, one of the choices for the language that come next alphabetically would be Itelmen, which is a language that's spoken by just a few dozen people. It's a language that's almost extinct. It's spoken on the Kamchatka Peninsula in eastern Russia, that's northeast of Japan. And one of their customs is displaying dead dogs on sticks as offerings. It's a picture from 1901 that shows that. So you could do that after your section or your chapter on Italian art. So a textbook that tried to be fair to all of the world's art by paying equal attention to each nation or region or language or GDP or population or anything would be very strange. These kinds of things could be done. It would be really interesting to see what one of them would look like. One like this one could entirely erase the standard history of art. You'd be in completely new territory because you would be so out of proportion to what the normal expected narratives are that they would probably be unrecognizable. If you had a page for each one of these three cultures, for example, you'd have to give equal time to the David and the whole Renaissance as you would, well, all of Italian art, not just the Renaissance, as you would to Iroquois art or Itelmen practices. Okay, the last of these three is less fanciful, it's less hypothetical. A number of people have tried to be fair to the world's art by distributing attention to different cultures, because after all, art history is part of cultural history. And so people have tried to write histories of world cultures by being fair to cultures depending on how important they were. The question is then, what counts as an important culture? So I have a couple of ideas there that have been tried in texts on art history. So this is an imaginary table of contents, but one of the criteria that has been proposed is by spending equal time on cultures that were elaborate or complex. So as I say in that text on the right, people have looked at cultures that had architecture, especially stone architecture. They have valued cultures depending on how many media they invented and explored, and whether they were writing about their art at the same time. So on the left, you could have something like the invention of history, and there are three large cultures or cultural areas of multiple cultures: the ancient Near East, Mesoamerica, India, prehistoric China, Korea, Japan. These are all cultures that you could value more or less equally or include in your narrative because each one of them had these elements of these accomplishments. This kind of valuation is very close to political history that has valued the idea of civilization. A civilization, roughly speaking, when you're talking about early civilizations, is a culture that had writing, that had that occupied a major area of land, that had a form of government that was well developed, and that had architecture, especially stone architecture. Those are among the criteria that cultures have usually had to possess in order to be called civilization. So you could try to be fair to cultures in some way like this by adjusting criteria like that. Another thing that's been proposed is that cultures should be privileged if they were self-reflective, if they had art criticism and art theory and so on. So you could have in such a textbook something like this. You could call these the historiographic traditions, because historiography is the study of how history is written. So these would be traditions or cultures that were self-reflective about their art. As I've sampled a couple of those in the history lecture 15. So China has centuries of tradition of writing about their art. And the same things happened in Korea and Japan and India, Islamic traditions also. And they would go along with Western traditions. So in theory, again, you could actually tell a history of art this way. And you would probably have to end by changing your criteria. You'd probably have to end by surveying by continent if you were doing a world art history survey. But this is just a thought experiment that's where I've put together some of the ideas that people have tried to use to value cultures and to balance out attention to cultures. The problem with this approach is that, as Chakrabarty would point out, it reproduces European Enlightenment values. It's experimental, that's a European Enlightenment value. It values, it privileges advanced cultures, that's also European Enlightenment value. Technical and material mastery, self-awareness, and writing. Those are all things that were privileged and explored starting in the European Enlightenment. So what you're actually doing in a history text like this, and these have been written for political and economic and other histories, is you're exporting yet more European values and judging according to them. So here's, just by way of conclusion, principal problems with each of these three topics. The first one, which was topic number 5, distributing attention through time. The problem there is that almost all art historians work on modern and contemporary art, and so you can't really tell the history of art and distribute your attention evenly through time. The second one, distributing attention around the world. It could be very interesting to try it, but it would almost certainly ruin any or erase any conventional narrative, I should say, which could be fine. That could be a complete a new way forward for art history. And last, you could distribute your attention to cultures, but I think that would be difficult or impossible to do without relying on values that are demonstrably European. You'd end up making a Eurocentric history of the world yet again. Okay, that's about it for these, and then there's one more lecture of these problems.